Hey everyone, in today's episode, I want to read a few of the passages from the recent article I published on my Substack newsletter. The article is called The Ukraine War, The Great Reset, and America's Grand Strategy, a comprehensive outline of geopolitical factors informing current events. And this article covers a lot of the material in a much tighter and more compact way that I covered in my previous podcast episode. But I want to go over it, a couple pieces from this because they elaborate and I think in a more improved way on some of the points I was trying to make in that longer podcast. So another reason I want to go over some of this material is that it gets to what my overarching hypothesis is, not only behind current events and geopolitics and in the Great Reset type of situation that's going on, but it goes into some of the underlying connections between the larger spiritual themes that I emphasize on the channel and how those interface with these troubling trends that we're seeing in civilization. So that comes at the end of the article. I'm not going to read the whole article, but I'm going to kind of give a summary of a big chunk of it, and then I'm going to read out the more towards the end. So to begin with, I want to read my preface, and it's called Philosophical Fundamentals. So before I go into any of the analysis that tries to link together a narrative to try to explain how the lockdowns and the Great Reset and all that stuff interfaces with the Ukraine war, I make sure to set out right at the outset the core ideas of esoteric philosophy, because it's the most important thing. It's the thing that puts everything into a context. It's the thing that gives us each a connection to a larger spiritual universe and to a sense of purpose and meaning beyond just following, storylines about how evil the leaders of the world are. So I'm going to read this first little preface section, and then I'm going to get into some of the summary of some of the article's main sections before I get to the conclusion. So this preface starts with me writing, on my podcast, in my written publications, and now in this Substack, I present a perspective on life that is grounded in the worldview of esoteric philosophy. I want to point this out at the beginning before I offer any assessment of current events, because this philosophical worldview emphasizes that behind earthly affairs is a divine plan rooted in cosmic law. Nothing that happens here on earth can ever change this eternal truth. The challenge for us is to seek to understand how this divine plan relates to the ongoing sequence of catastrophes that mankind has been continuously creating for itself over the past several thousand years. Is the ultimate problem that the universe is unjust and capricious? Or is it that it is governed by a framework of immutable laws and principles, and we continually fall into catastrophe because we don't learn its rules or obey its laws? In other words, we live by the mantra, let not thy will be done, but mine. Could this be the root of our problems? The philosophical worldview of esoteric philosophy expresses a relatively simple set of ideas and principles that we must learn to trust in and stay centered upon. The most important of these first principles is the idea that all existence is contained within an all-encompassing unity. This unity is traditionally called God. When God enters into a creative state in order to fashion a universe, it does so by manifesting an orderly sequence of emanations within itself. This creative act represents the emergence of diversity within the underlying context of an eternal unity. The great philosophical schools of antiquity understood this divine unity to be equivalent to what we now call consciousness. To them, creation is the result of consciousness moving in upon itself so that it may create for itself an experience of self-consciousness. In this pattern of thinking, creation, what we call the universe, exists as a great temple fashioned for the purpose of creating an immense garden of experience within which an exploration of self-consciousness can take place. The great psychologist Stanislav Grof called this process the cosmic game, and notes that what we call life is actually a process of consciousness inhabiting a world of its own creation in order that it may undergo a sequence of evolving experiences. This cosmic game, or as I like to think of it, a cosmic meditation, is structured and sequenced according to an archetypal pattern that is immutable and unchangeable. This was the essential teachings of Plato, who was an ambassador of the esoteric teachings, and we would be wise to keep our analysis tethered to his line of reasoning. I note all this here at the outset because this basic framework of ideas informs us that there is a big picture behind the fumblings and missteps of humanity. In other words, there is a divine cosmic backdrop against which this current episode in human affairs is taking place. We do not live in a random, meaningless universe. In fact, we are moving from a place to a place. And in some mysterious fashion, this current dramatic episode in human history is part of the unfoldment of a great divine plan. So that was my introduction. And now let's go into the first few sections. So in the first section, it's called Pax Americana. And I here go into this idea that the British Empire and the elite behind it gradually transferred over into America to fuel and catalyze what will become the American Empire. And a lot of the American Empire was fueled by the formation of a new money class that came along with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. So the monopolists and the cartels, such as the Rockefellers, for example, that's like the classic name. But many of those industrialists from the turn of the last century were people who ended up playing big roles in the formation of what would become the American Empire. Now, I think there's another story to this that we'll be exploring more that has to do with the idea that America became the host ground of a completely submerged project, like a Manhattan-style project, and that this whole empire trajectory that America went on was in part fueled by the idea that this concealment of this project and of the sciences related to it created the necessity for the justification of a scientific materialism worldview to become popularized. And that worldview became the consensus opinion among the governing elite of this empire. But all the while, behind this group, and I think unaware, outside of the awareness of them, was this deeper research project. And this is actually something I talk about in the conclusion, because this is my kind of grand theory here, is that, you know, on one hand, we have what Manly Hall calls the secret destiny of America, and the idea that America was set aside for a greater purpose. And then we have the reality of the current situation, which is that America has fueled this incredibly extractive global capitalist empire over the past 100 plus years and is responsible for much of the atrocities in the world. And American foreign policy and its use of economic hitmen and its use of finance and its extractive corporations to implement its global strategy, global grand strategy of world domination. I think that mandate comes from the fact that America conceals this inner core, this inner hidden jewel, but the people who have been tasked or mandated with creating a global governance structure that I think is necessary for this hidden paradigm, this new paradigm of science and civilization to come out, that a global governance structure had to be set up. And so America and the American Empire was the one that was tasked with this situation. But it had to, part of the challenge here was that the people who would be responsible for making that happen were ones who couldn't know about the technological potentials and the weapons potentials of how this different paradigm of science could be used, because they would misuse it. So this sets up this type of psychic splitting in which a type of fake reality had to be created in which this global empire and global governance structure could be created over the course of 100 plus years. And I think we're at the end game of that now, or nearing it. But that's this basic idea that, America started off with lofty ambitions and then quickly a complex dynamic changed. So also keep in mind that the founding of America and its Constitution and its institutional structure, the thing that's so great about America was set up at the end of the agricultural age, right before the onset of the industrial age. So things drastically changed only a few decades after the founding of the country. And that sort of sets the stage for all the drama and complexities of human affairs that have emerged since then, and the role that America's played in that story. So that's the basic narrative motif that I'm going to be dealing with in future articles on the Substack and in future podcasts and upcoming publication. because it's a complex story, it's a complex dynamic, because it's not just a situation that America is this evil force in the world. I mean, it is on one level, but on another level, I think that there's a deeper story and there's a deeper purpose and meaning behind why things have played out as they have. But in this first section called Pax Americana, I just set out the basic idea that after the British Empire, the concept of empire, or the role that empire has in the world, that role was taken over by America and by this oligarchical class in America. And to kind of prove the point that America is an empire is I have a map here that I pulled from the internet that shows the global layout of where all the military bases are, and you can just see the complete coverage of the world and U.S. military bases and all the seas dominated by America's naval fleet. And then, tied to that military presence, we have the fact that we have the dollar as the reserve currency. And that's the situation that this global military presence really enforces. So that's the basic situation. And I also go into the role that the military industrial complex plays in this global empire, and the role that finance plays as well. So yeah, that's the first section. The second section is something I'm definitely going to be revisiting in future articles. It's called The Role of the Deep State in American Empire. And I basically try to make the case here that there's a big gulf in the way that America is portrayed in the world and the way that Americans typically see themselves and see America's actions in the world. And there's also a huge discrepancy in the way that the bureaucrats and the sort of professional class that are responsible for running the infrastructure of America's global empire, how they see themselves, and then the reality of the situation. And I try to make the case that whole cognitive dissonance type of thing is possible because the dirty aspects of the American empire are done by something that's off the books and it's unacknowledged, and it's called that's what the concept of deep state is supposed to refer to. It's something outside of the public awareness. It's outside of the awareness of the democratic institutions of the country. It's outside of formal oversight from those institutions. And so it becomes this shadow complex, essentially. It becomes this great collective shadow entity that it can metastasize. It has a lot of social space without oversight and without feedback and proper governance restrictions. It is able to perform all types of havoc on the world. And so this global empire is really, in a lot of ways, the work of this deep state. And I talk about the different branches of the deep state because it's partly military, it's partly covert operations, it's partly financial, it's partly corporate, it's partly technological. And so I try to do a very thorough analysis of the deep state and basically how it works in terms of serving this American empire, this oligarchical empire that the American elite, in association with their allies in the global capitalist class, how they have come together to create this empire. So the deep state plays a very important role in this system. And they basically set up a situation where, like, through their activities, they create the enemies of the state that then the overt institutions of the country, the democratic institutions like the legislature, the executive branch, and then the military, and all the sort of formal overt group can mobilize against. So just think about Al-Qaeda as being a creation of the deep state, which is then leveraged in order to mobilize the whole country and the military and public opinion and stuff to go and justify the war on terror and doing all these military activities in the Middle East. So the actual purpose of those military activities has nothing to do with what the stated objectives are, but instead have to do with ensuring the stability and the continued dominance of American hegemony while also moving chess pieces on the board into setting up the next stage. So overall, there seems to be a mandate within this oligarchical group that's running the country and running the world, since Western Europe and the leaders of most countries are essentially vassals, sort of like puppet regimes of Washington and Wall Street's interests. But yeah, my thinking is that that these groups have somehow an implicit mandate to do this type of global extractive activity, and a space has been created for them and carved out for them to do these activities, and so the deep state plays a big role in that. And then I give this a type of psychoanalysis of the deep state that I think is interesting for those people who have followed my depth psychology material. I want to read the last little section of this deep state part of this document. So I write, the deep state is in many ways the social equivalent to the collective shadow concept that we find in depth psychology. As with Jung's shadow concept, it represents a realm of human activity that is submerged to the active consciousness of the collective. Having become repressed within civilization's subconscious, it exerts a pernicious influence on the whole and metastasizes into a whole range of malevolent expressions and complexes that are detrimental to humanity's social, psychological, and spiritual health. In Jung's view, the way to treat the shadow is to make what is unconscious conscious, meaning we must shine a light into the darkness in order that we may begin to confront the elements of ourselves that we have repressed and failed to constructively process or deal with. So this what I'm trying to say here is that, collectively as a nation, we've gotten very rich on behalf of these extractive policies we have all over the world, but we don't see ourselves as that way. We don't see ourselves as being this imperialistic force in the world, and that's due to this dynamic of the deep state activity mixed with the overt society's refusal to acknowledge the fact that there is a deep state. So it's this inability to process and to accept the reality that we have a shadow collectively that keeps us in this place of like psychological splitting. And so that's why we act in very neurotic ways, and the whole lockdown and COVID situation really demonstrated our own neuroticism, and it's not just Americans; it's sort of the whole global, I think of it as the global bureaucratic class that has their career and benefits from the way world trade and world finance and world politics has worked out over the past 100+ years. It's this coalescence of interests of people who are benefiting from the current system, and then they have a need to see it as legitimate and to see themselves as being part of something, see themselves as having dedicated themselves to something that is legitimate. And I think part of that leads to this, this obsession with conspiracy theory in terms of people wanting to dismiss anything that challenges that worldview, to just label it as conspiracy theory, never look into it, never take any kind of critical look at it, and then just dismiss things because of this self-identity situation that is taking place. So just lastly, I conclude the section by saying that in energetic terms, the emergence of a shadow complex represents the formation of a blockage within the flow of energy within a system. In order to promote healing and to recover from the manifestation of disease caused by the blockage, one must actively work to find the hidden submerged elements fueling the blockage and work to clear them. In this way, the normal flow of energy within the system can be restored and health naturally regained. And so the lesson here is that to begin to overcome the situation that we're in, we really just have to apply the rule of law, because the deep state, sort of by definition, exists outside of the rule of law. It exists outside the democratic institutions or the formal laws and statutes of a country. And it's given that space to do so, and it's justified through various, what's called national security needs or whatever. But really, it's the needs to establish this global empire. So then I move on. The third section is called America's Geostrategic Approach to Eurasia. And here I overview the idea that from the perspective of American empire, one of the primary strategic factors that they're concerned with is the threat of a rival power arising in the world. And so Eurasia, being the great landmass, would be the place where the threat could arise. And so for for this type of thinking, an alliance between Germany and Russia was traditionally the great threat and the thing that was to be avoided at all costs. And then, maybe today you might say China alliance between China, Russia, and Germany would be like the ultimate threat. But in that light, with keeping this simple idea in mind that America has this existential need to prevent a major power rising in Eurasia, then that means the trajectory of its foreign policy is to prevent such an alliance happening, to segregate, to create scenarios where the segregation of Germany from Russia and or from also China would be set up. And so that is actually where you get a lot of the deep state activity, is to prevent to covertly prevent the alliances forming between these groups. And as another aspect of this, you could also look at there's just a greater strategy, I think, within the domestic policies of each country that, America has this strategic need for, everybody to play ball according to its imperialistic agenda. And what its endgame is in terms of establishing a global governance based on its, control of that system. And so to do this, you really can't have other nations be truly sovereign and truly able to act in their own economic interests and own military and security interests. You have to be involved in the domestic policies of all these other countries around the world to ensure that those countries have people who are going to play ball with the American model. And I think that explains a lot of the covert activities as well, and a lot of U.S. intelligence operations and things like that, is to, do these campaigns to make sure that things never get out of hand in terms of a major power like Germany going in its own direction and doing things that are going to be purely for the benefit of itself. Because, the whole EU enterprise is not, there's a lot of beneficial aspects to it, but it's certainly not in the economic interests of Germany to participate in that larger scheme, particularly because its currency is tied in with the whole bloc. And then there's one interest rate. I mean, there's one, financial monetary policy for the whole bloc that applies to all the countries that Germany is tethered to because of its participation in it. So in a way, the EU project was a way to, for the U.S. to politically neutralize Germany, just for example. But if you keep, again, this idea in mind of wanting to prevent alliance between, these major power blocs in Eurasia, you can see that in World War I and World War II, it was Germany and Russia pitted against each other. And then again in the Cold War, these two nations, at least the industrial Western Germany, that the more powerful aspect of Germany developed, that was pitted against Russia. So you never had an alliance formed between the two. And those dynamics have continued to play out, again, with this EU situation being a more contemporary factor. So that's kind of sort of discussing that and going into detail about that is the purpose of this third section called America's Geostrategic Approach to Eurasia. Then the next section is building off some of the stuff I was just talking about. It's called Regime Change in Ukraine. But it starts off talking about how regime change is one of those deep state tactics to ensure that you have the countries around the world play ball according to the American blueprint and the American and greater grand strategy. And so those who go against this or begin to act in a way where they want to use their resources independent of American corporate interests and financial interests, and they want to develop for their own national strength and purposes, those countries get targeted for regime change. And I go into all that to build the background to the fact that Ukraine was a country where this happened twice since 2000. It happened in 2004 and 2014. You had two different, U.S.-backed and deep state-involved coups take place in the country. And you really can't understand the current situation in Ukraine without factoring in that dynamic of those two coups and the role that the U.S. had in fostering and developing those coups. And so the outcome of both those coups was to ensure that you had a pro-Europe, pro-NATO, pro-West regime coming in Ukraine, and one that was openly antagonistic and hostile to Russia. And the governments that got overthrown both times were ones who were looking to build, economic and political relationships with Russia, so as to better benefit their country. Because part of the American strategy to ensure that the countries play ball is to privatize their key industries to American interests, so that there's no opportunity for them to be, repurposed towards developing the country as any kind of power or any kind of independent voice in the world. So, yeah, that's the next section, going into the background of the regime change and what the consequences have been in the 8 years since that 2014 regime change operation, how those set the stage for the current conflict. And then the next section number 5, it's called Russia's Perspective on Ukraine and NATO. And I talk about how a number of events, not just the coups, but a number of events since then, including many in the months preceding the current war, were ones where it seems as if NATO and the U.S. Were deliberately creating an environment so as to provoke Russia to move into Ukraine, to provoke the attack. And so I kind of build that case and give the Russian perspective about how they saw things taking place in Ukraine. They've been very clear for like 30 years about, what things would be considered crossing a line in terms of Ukraine and Georgia and some of the states that are bordering their country. And their main thing was like the militarization of these countries. And so, incrementally you have the U.S. and NATO powers move to go against and cross that line. And it's my, my thinking, and the thinking of a lot of people, is that this was a deliberate maneuver to get Russia to move into Ukraine to create this war. So, and this way of framing the situation, Ukraine is like a proxy, is a victim in a area where there's a proxy battle going on. But it seems as if the purpose of this proxy war is to not just involve Russia in a war and to have a number of like immediate factors come into the playing field as a consequence of that move, such as turning Europe against, in the public opinion of Europe, against Russia, but also, in my opinion, it's to trigger these secondary reactions, these economic sanctions, and a number of other things that would take place in an environment that's already very fragile and destable as a result of the lockdowns. And it seems like all this comes together to support this larger Great Reset initiative. So we seem to be, this war in this framing seems to be supporting this idea that there is maybe a more advanced stage of this agenda now that we're moving towards, because things have been seriously destable now across the world and across the economic and financial system, and the political balance of political alliances between countries is being seriously affected because of this. So I want to read the very last paragraph of that section. So I'll just pick up. Perhaps more accurately, it's not the war itself that the West desires, but rather the shocks to the global system that this conflict will inevitably bring, which is the desired end goal. Russia's transparency in what constitutes its red line makes its behavior somewhat predictable. If you know that Russia is going to act in a predictable defensive fashion based on the militarization of its neighbor, then you can maneuver circumstances in the surrounding geopolitical theater into a position favorable to your own larger grand strategy. When Russia makes its move, it will trigger a number of secondary and tertiary responses that have been set up beforehand, ones that are favorable to the Western elite's greater global plans. And then the next section, this sinks right into the next section. The next section is called A Deeper Game Being Played. So this is where I'm going to pick up and start reading from the article. Less than 2 weeks before Russia launched its military offensive into Ukraine, an international conference was hosted titled Geopolitical War of the West Against Russia, the Ukrainian Case. So in that event, a variety of thought leaders who represent the Russian point of view discussed what they thought the U.S.'s underlying grand strategy might be in provoking a Russian attack. The consensus at the conference was that Washington had much to gain from a Russian war in Ukraine. One clear consequence of such a war would be to create a political and economic divide between Europe and Russia and to foster an anti-Russian consensus across Europe that would help to maintain that divide for the foreseeable future. On this, one commentator at the event noted, with every new piece of information about Russia's imminent attack on Ukrainian territory, there is a wave of news about this need for new sanctions, such as stopping the Nord Stream pipeline, and the correctness of sending American troops and weapons to Europe. We understand why this is being done. And now that the war is underway, we can see that all these predictions are coming true in real time. Now, another factor is Washington's desire to foster political instability in Russia in order to undermine Putin's control over the government. The economic sanctions that everyone knew would come as a result of war in Ukraine served to weaken Russia's economy, isolate it from the rest of the world, and drain the strength and morale of Russia's military. All of these work to undercut Putin's domestic popularity, which in turn strengthens Washington's chances at fostering regime change in Russia. As one conference speaker noted, ultimately the imposed sanctions should greatly undermine the position of the Russian president, turn the elites against him, and thereby accelerate what Western strategists want, the removal of the Russian president. And the third factor discussed at the conference was that the Western powers needed to create a new common enemy around which public opinion can be corralled and its vast bureaucracy mobilized. During the Cold War, this enemy was the USSR. After 1990, this was replaced with the more vague enemy of international terrorism with an emphasis on Islam. Now that this is no longer so effective, Russia is being brought back to reprise its old role as enemy of the state. Russia is particularly effective in this part because it gives a clear rationale in which to further consolidate and strengthen the NATO bloc, which had, quote, lost all meaning without a clear geopolitical opponent. And after that, I give my own synopsis. I say, while I agree with the reasoning of these discussion points, I feel that there is a deeper game being played, one that also factors in 3 points. Number one, the controlled demolition of the global economy, which has been in the works at least since the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, and which has greatly accelerated since the global lockdowns of 2020 to 22. Number two, the global rollout of the Great Reset Initiative and the transition to the Fourth Industrial Revolution, two campaigns that seem to be centered in the machinations of the World Economic Forum and its lead spokesman, Klaus Schwab. It is notable to point out that neither Russia nor China are against these transitions and in fact appear to be willing participants in catalyzing this reset alongside America and its allies in Western Europe. And by that, I'm pointing out to the fact that, the lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, the move to, vaccine passports and digital IDs, those are also happening not only in the West, but in Russia as well. And we all know that they've been happening in China. So on one hand, we have this antagonism between the military aspects of these nation states, but the inner governance aspects, the so-called technocracy of these countries, they seem to be in alignment and moving in lockstep between and among each other. And there's also close ties between these countries in terms of their mutual involvement in the World Economic Forum, which seems to be the central coordinating ground of this campaign to transition the world into a new form of governance. And then the last point I say that's part of the larger game being played here is that the coordination of central banks of the world to transform the global financial system into a new all-digital form of existence is also taking place at the same time. This new system, organized around the worldwide rollout of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, will be ushered in as a replacement for the debt-based fiat model of currency that the global economic and geopolitical order has been organized around for the past 100 years. This new digital version of currency will undoubtedly be tied to the implementation of digital ID and social credit systems like that which is being prototyped in China. The adoption of this new system will lead to a massive transformation in the way governance is practiced all over the globe, with traditional democratic institutions replaced by a new governance scheme centered in the unelected and unaccountable bureaucracies of an elite global financial, corporate, and scientific class, or what is today commonly referred to as a technocratic elite. So, Keeping these factors in mind, it is not so much the Ukrainian war itself that ties into these greater underlying motions of civilization. It is the series of economic and geopolitical shocks that the war inevitably brings forth. These shocks serve to catalyze these parallel motions already underway, potentially bringing things to a tipping point where the major changes to global governance that appear to be waiting in the wings might be rapidly catalyzed. This amounts to transitioning the Great Reset from its current planning stage to a forthcoming implementation stage. And now I'm going to try to tie the Ukraine war in with these larger moves. So the major economic and political consequences of this current Ukrainian war directly interface with the Great Reset and the greater geopolitical motions referenced above in the following ways. So again, I point out three different main points of alignment. Number one, a rapid deconstruction of the global financial system. Since the onset of the global lockdowns of 2020, the world economy, already in an extremely unstable condition as a result of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, entered into a terminal phase. The debt super bubble that had been ballooned up since the early 90s, though one might even track it back to the early 70s, could no longer be propped up in a way that would ensure a return to normal for the global system. The strategic value of the lockdowns was that it allowed things to be kept afloat a little longer while the transition to a new replacement model was being prepared. And I want to note that were it not for the lockdowns and the whole shutdown policies, there likely would have been a major financial crisis at the end of 2019. So the lockdowns had the effect of ballooning up global debt for one last major push. A global financial system already insolvent by 2019 had now reached its endgame. The question is, when will the collapse and resulting transition to a new global governance order take place? Events in Ukraine may be the catalyst that is needed for a final push away from the old system and into its long-planned replacement. So that was point number one, the financial system. Number two, the massive reorganization of the global political and economic superstructure. The economic sanctions triggered by the war in Ukraine promise to further deconstruct international trade relationships and supply chain networks, two shifts that were already well underway thanks to the global lockdowns of 2020. The current sanctions on Russia, which essentially involve A, removing Russia from participating in the global financial system, B, facilitating a near worldwide embargo on importing Russian energy or food commodities, and C, promoting a widespread corporate boycott of the Russian market, will serve to increase an already growing trend of economic fractionalization across the globe. The West's coordinated plan of enacting aggressive economic and financial sanctions on Russia will force Russia to make itself almost completely autonomous from the West. This is actually a move that Russia, along with its peers in Iran, China, and India, have long been preparing for. This move has often been framed as one of de-dollarization, a motion that is based on their shared desire to move outside of their historical position as being dependent on America's dollar hegemony. It is likely, however, that the dollar's days of being the global reserve currency are numbered anyway, as its stability as a currency has been seriously undermined due to a number of domestic factors. With a global CBDC system being planned by the U.S. Central Bank in collusion with its peers around the world, perhaps an isolated Eastern Eurasia bloc is part of a greater global reorganization plan. It's important to note that the homegrown solutions that these countries, Russia, China, and India, have been developing to meet this new challenge feature many, if not all, of the same core features that Western nations are looking to implement in their own forthcoming financial transformations, namely a digital currency interlinked with a digital ID and social credit system. Could there be a high level of coordination taking place between the West and East in order to bring the whole world into a new global governance superstructure at the same time? Certainly, it is possible. There is another important factor to consider here. The political and economic elite of Russia and China share close ties with the American and European elite and their shared involvement in the now infamous World Economic Forum. This is the point I made earlier. Is there a level of collusion taking place behind the scenes where nations who openly act as if they are in conflict are, on a higher level, actually colluding toward the same end goals? It seems likely that Russia's expulsion from Western capitalism will only push them into closer economic and political partnership with China and India. As we explored above, it has long been a core interest of American grand strategists to prevent major partnerships from developing between Eurasian powers. But if we are moving into an explicitly international governance superstructure, where the nation state is no longer central, perhaps the formation of a Central and East Asian bloc is no longer the severe threat it was once perceived to be. If the American elite plan to transition themselves into leadership positions within this new transnational governance superstructure, perhaps their perspective on what constitutes, quote, vital national security threats to America will change. Under a new institutional paradigm of global governance, perhaps an East Eurasian union between Russia and China is not so undesirable. While current events will undoubtedly push Russia, China, and perhaps India together into closer economic and political partnership, they will also have a similar effect in the West in terms of pushing America and its allies in Britain and Western Europe into a tighter system of economic and political partnership. The Western Bloc is uniting together in the enforcement of extreme sanctions against Russia, and perhaps in the future China, due to the Taiwan situation, will be added to this campaign. This means that these Western nations will need to unite together to find internal solutions for themselves to make up for the losses in trade of energy and commodities that will result from their collective sanctioning of Russia and possibly China. We're already seeing this with Germany, who is highly dependent on Russian gas exports. Russia's exclusion from the Western economic system has forced Germany to become more dependent on American exports to meet their energy needs. This will serve to increase the overall integration between the two countries, and more specifically, Germany's overall dependency on the US. And now the third factor that I look at is the destabilization of the global energy system. One of the key pillars of the Great Reset involves a global coordinated transition away from the traditional fuels of the industrial age: oil, coal, gas, and nuclear, and into the so-called green new economy. The problem is that the promoted alternatives to traditional carbon-based fuels are not adequate to meet the energy needs of the West, let alone the world as a whole. For one, they aren't consistent in how they produce energy. They also aren't very green in terms of their net environmental impact. And while it is true that they are successful in their promise of reducing carbon into the atmosphere, it's not at all settled whether the much touted theory of a carbon-based cause for climate change is actually scientifically sound. Even though no viable replacement exists for so-called fossil fuels, and I have my doubts that these fuel sources actually come from decayed biotic material, and this is something that I really learned from F. William Engdahl in his book Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars. But if you just think about it, like the stupidest thing of all time is to think that the trillions and trillions of barrels of oil that have been produced, since the onset of the industrial age have come from deposits of decayed plants and dinosaurs. I mean, it's absurd. And he makes the point, or he proves in his research, and he cites, kind of classified research from Russia, that a lot of the oil wells, once they dry up, will actually refill over time. So the underlying idea is that oil and petroleum and coal and things like that are produced from natural processes within the earth, natural geological processes. And the whole idea of masking that truth in the scientific literature and make people believe it's fossil fuels is to create a situation in which the cartels who control that trade can put out this narrative of peak oil and thereby sort of consolidate their control of the market and the pricing structure, and to make sure that not too much oil comes out on the market in order to crash their monopoly of it. And that whole thing is not just about greed, it's also about geopolitics. And the oil baron, the major oil companies are very, very tightly integrated with the U.S. national security state. And it's also interesting that when you go into who funds the research on the so-called carbon-based theory of climate change and the new green economy, the major think tanks and nonprofits that are behind this drive to, get rid of traditional fuel sources and move to wind and solar and things like that, they happen to be funded by, when you go behind the scenes, funded by the major oil companies and the financial banks tied with those oil companies. And again, those are all linked to the U.S. national security state. So there seems to be some type of strategy behind the whole thing. So I just want to point all that out without going into the details of it. But if you're interested in more, F. William Engdahl's book, Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars is definitely worth checking out. So picking back up, I note that here we come to a key question. Could this unfolding energy crisis facilitate a search for and recovery of new forms of energy beyond so-called renewables? ones that relate to a completely different paradigm of physics, one that leverages the long forgotten and dismissed concept of the ether. Such a model was once touted by Nikola Tesla, who once claimed to have developed energy technologies which drew energy out of the metaphysical fabric of space itself. Textbooks have long since forgotten about him, but could there have secretly been a group of researchers who never strayed from his ideas and who continued to develop them all along? Before we explore this vital question further, there is one additional factor related to the global energy trade that needs to be considered, namely the food economy. One major consequence of the economic war going on between Russia and the West involves the disruption of the global food economy. This disruption is taking place on three fronts. A, trading relationships between Russia and Ukraine and the rest of the world are adversely affected. And it's notable that together they produce a large percentage of global wheat exports. Point B, the supply chains linking producer and consumer economies are disrupted, while the price of transportation linking those markets is also simultaneously increased. And so overall, the availability of food is harmed and the price of food is increased. And then lastly, given that industrial agriculture utilizes synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, which utilize quote-unquote fossil fuels, and their production, increases in energy prices have the indirect effect of making food more costly to produce. And I conclude this section by noting that it is unknown what the long-term political and social welfare effects will be around the world as a consequence of the increased volatility we're seeing in global energy and food markets. These effects promise to be particularly intense in food importing nations and in the poorer nations of the world, such as those in Africa and the Middle East. These dynamics could play a major factor in driving the larger geopolitical and economic reorganization schemes taking place across the global chessboard, as discussed above. And now finally we get to the last section, the great unknown factor in human affairs. The fact that the US military has officially admitted to the fact that UFOs exist, without offering any explanation of how they work or where they come from, suggests to me that some mysterious entity inside the American national security state has been secretly developing breakthrough technologies based on an alternate paradigm of science, one not grounded in the limitations and flaws of the now dominant worldview of scientific materialism. A crisis in the global energy system, mixed with the move toward a transnational model of governance with full spectrum surveillance capability, set the stage for a complete revolution in energy science and technology. This is a topic that I will return to many times in future articles, but for now it stands to reason that the great unseen hand driving current events and the direction of global governance may be a factor that goes beyond the usual explanation of greedy capitalists and sociopathic eugenicists. Rather, it could be that an unseen, off-the-books Manhattan Project-style science and technology program lies hidden beneath the heart of the American military-industrial finance complex and its deep state. A survey of the respective worldviews of A, the deep state entities we know about, B, the global capitalist and technocratic elite at the World Economic Forum, and C, the military strategists behind Pax Americana, reveals that all share in common a core belief in and attachment to the paradigm of scientific materialism. This may not be a coincidence. I ask, could a secret association of scientists working on an alchemy-based model of physics have shielded themselves and their research projects from the eyes of the world by concealing themselves behind a technocratic metastructure that is trained to not believe in its existence? In other words, while the military strategists in Washington, their allies in the Federal Reserve, and the corporate leaders of the various cartels that dominate the global economy plan to take their place as rulers of the forthcoming global governance system that they have been strategically maneuvering into place over an untold period of time, perhaps they will instead find another hidden entity rising to take control instead, just at the very moment when victory seems so close at hand. Perhaps the transition into a formal system of global governance, where hostile competition between nation-states and capitalist enterprises is no longer supported, will finally create the conditions necessary for the externalization of this invisible college, quote unquote, to take place. The invisible college is something that comes from Rosicrucianism. A disclosure which would include not only an admission of their own secret existence, but also a revelation of the various breakthrough technologies they have developed and the alternate ether-based paradigm of science they have refined over an unknown period of time. This, my friends, is the great question at the heart of modern civilization. Could there be an invisible hand guiding the destiny of the human race that not even the elite military and financial powers of the world know about? No one can explain the existence of the UFOs. Perhaps this is the unexpected answer that this recent revelation will bring forth. As I stated in the introduction, we are moving from a place to a place. Perhaps there is a hidden power here on Earth silently guiding us toward a greater destiny and higher purpose, one that no one has foreseen, but which has silently been here all along, waiting patiently for the world to come to a state when it could safely reveal itself. Time will tell. And that's where I end things in the article, and that's where I'm going to end things with this podcast. But I do feel like there is this deeper game being played, and there are many aspects of what's going on in the world that have not been fully explored. And the fact that, we're all talking about the Great Reset and the, transhumanist vision of that group and the sort of total full spectrum dominance, control over human beings and human society, all that stuff is based on a paradigm of scientific materialism. And, the great factor that we have to respect and consider is the fact that just prior to this lockdown and war and Great Reset initiative all coming out and going like full throttle, is we have this revelation of the UFOs and the fact that the military has known about this for some time. This is something we already knew, but I'm just saying as an official revelation in the New York Times and in Washington press conferences, we have this coming out, and nobody has factored that into their analysis. No one knows what to do with it. No one knows what to make of it. And so, in my opinion, this is the great question. How does that factor into this larger story? So, I'm going to leave that for here, but I'm definitely going to be picking this back up in future articles and in future podcast episodes and in a future publication. So please keep track of everything. If you haven't followed me on Substack, it's free. Just put in your email and you'll start to get many articles in your inbox. It's thewisdomtradition.substack.com, and you can also find a link on my website, alexsacken.com. Thank you very much for tuning in. God bless.